Hello and welcome to my channel. Last week my sister and I went to this lovely rose garden in the heart of Madrid city. So many beautiful roses in bloom. We took lots of photographs so that there's plenty of reference images for the rest of the year. This is a fairly easy although very beautiful rose that we are going to paint today. First I use a large brush to apply a wash of just clean water. There are many ways of painting a rose. This one is easier because it has a very homogeneous color, which allows us to paint this huge wash of very dilute permanent rose all over the petals. This is the lightest shade of pink that we see on this rose. I only used 3 pigments for the rose: permanent rose, Winsor violet and Winsor blue. I created a few mixes with these colors which I'll tell you on the go. Here I laid down a dilute mix of Winsor violet with permanent rose and then used my brush to spread out the paint and soften the edges. Now the base layer is done, and when the shine on the paper is almost gone, I started lifting highlights. This means to gently remove pigment with a clean damp brush to reveal the lightest areas. Then with my 000 round brush, I took a small amount of the mixture of permanent rose with Winsor violet and started to lay down the colors. Some people start their rose paintings with the outer petals. However, I prefer painting from inside and gradually move outwards because this gives you some realism very early on, and that helps to keep you motivated. So here again I laid down some permanent rose with Winsor violet, cream-like ratio, and then cleaned my brush and used the damp brush to spread the paint and soften the edges. Now I took a small amount of permanent rose, milk-like ratio, laid it down, and I'm using my damp brush to spread the paint and soften the edges. Now I took a very dilute permanent rose with my round brush number 3 and applied on this petal. Then I took a small amount of the mixture of permanent rose with Winsor violet with my round brush 000 and applied it to the corner of this petal. So the idea is applying darker values where the petals are overlapping and lighter values towards the end of the petals, and use damp brush to always soften and smoothen the edges so that the transitions are more natural and beautiful. Remember not to paint the adjoining petals while they are still wet, as it may cause bleeding of paint from one area to another. Choose petals that are separated with dry areas so that you don't have to wait every time for the paint to dry. So on this petal, first I applied a glaze of water, and then I applied the mixture of Winsor violet with permanent rose on the corners, and now I'm using the brush to soften the edges, and I dropped in a small amount of permanent rose in the center to give that pink glow. I did the same thing on this top petal. First I applied a glaze of water, then a thicker consistency permanent rose with my round brush number 3, then cleaned the brush and use the damp brush to spread the paint and soften the edges. Then I picked a small amount of the mixture of permanent rose with Winsor violet and then applied in this corner, and now I'm softening the edges. I took some more of the same mixture and applied here. For this petal here on the left, using wet on wet technique, I applied a dilute mixture of permanent rose for the mid-tones, and then I took my round brush 000 and a thicker consistency of the mixture of permanent rose with Winsor violet and applied it to this area where the petals were overlapping. Now let's paint some of the darkest darks of this painting. For this I prepared a thicker consistency cream-like ratio of permanent rose with Winsor blue, and using my round brush 000 applied to these small areas. This helps to create depth in the painting. Then I applied a glaze of water on this petal and then took my round brush number 3 with permanent rose and Winsor violet, gently laid down the pigment and then moved the paint around with my brush. There's very little pigment on the brush. Then on the top corner of the petal, I laid a little bit more of the same mixture and then used my damp brush to smoothen the edges. Then I took some more of the same paint mixture and with a few short quick movements in the direction of the petals, I laid down the paint and then softened the edges both on top and bottom with a slightly damp brush. Then I took the same paint mixture but in a thicker consistency and with a thinner brush and I applied it at the base of this petal. Here in this petal, I used the wet and wet technique with a very dilute mixture of permanent rose and round brush number 3. Once again, I took the mixture of permanent rose with Winsor blue in a very thick consistency and applied in these small areas to create depth. This is milk-like ratio of the permanent rose and Winsor violet at the base and the sides of the petal. Then I dropped in some permanent rose in the middle area and then spread it around with the brush. Please drop me a like and subscribe if you haven't already. This helps me to reach more people on YouTube. Thank you very much for your support. Now I applied a glaze of water on this petal and then with my round brush number 6 and permanent rose with Winsor violet, I applied a dilute wash of milk-like ratio, leaving a highlight in the middle. This highlight will represent the light reflected by the fold of the petal. I applied a small amount of permanent rose on the edge of this petal and deepened the color at the base. Now I prepared this area with a glaze of water and then applied a dilute wash of permanent rose, spreading the paint all over the area. And then dropped in a mixture of permanent rose with Winsor violet at the base of the cup area. Now I used the wet on wet technique to paint this largest petal on the top with a cream-like ratio of permanent rose and Winsor violet at the base of the petal. I dropped in some permanent rose to give that strong pink glow. Then I took some more permanent rose with a slightly thicker consistency and I applied the paint using quick short brush movement towards the base of the petal. Then with a slightly damp brush I softened the edges. This creates the illusion of some soft wrinkles on the petal. Now that the cup area is dry, I applied a small amount of the mixture of permanent rose with Winsor violet to create depth. Then I moved on to this large petal at the left, applied a glaze of water, and then took some of the permanent rose mixed with Winsor violet of milk-like ratio and laid it down at the base of the petal. I used my brush to spread the paint around and then dropped in some permanent rose for the pink glow. Then I took some more of the permanent rose mixed with Winsor violet and then applied it on the bottom edge of this petal. To show that this petal is further away than the top petal, that is to say, to create depth, I applied a mixture of permanent rose with Winsor blue. I also dropped in some French ultramarine blue, since blue is a cool color and it helps to push away an area visually. Here on the top right petal, using the wet on wet technique, I applied a glaze of water and then took a mixture of permanent rose with Winsor violet milk-like ratio and applied it all over the petal. Here I also dropped in some French ultramarine to create color harmony and also visual interest. I left untouched the middle section of the petal. Remember, it has a very light permanent rose as the base color. Then I took a small amount of permanent rose mixed with Winsor violet in thicker consistency to apply in those dark areas. I painted the leaves in just one layer using wet on wet technique and only two main colors, Viridian and cadmium yellow. Viridian is a single pigment cool green color. It is slightly granulating. When used alone, it looks a bit unnatural because it's too vibrant. So I created two different mixtures. One with more amount of cadmium yellow to create a sap green like color, and the other with lesser cadmium yellow for a cooler green. The cooler mixture is also darker in value. So the idea is applying the cooler green in the darker areas and the warmer greens in the lighter areas of the leaves. While the paper is still wet, I dropped in some burnt umber in places. The veins on the leaves can be created by the lifting technique, but for that we must wait that the shine on the paper is gone. So meanwhile, I added a glaze of water on the bottom leaf. Now the paper was ready, so I took my clean damp brush, carefully removed the excess water and used it to lift color to create the veins. You don't have to get all of them. Then I took some mixture of the cool green that is mixed with less cadmium yellow and applied on the left side of the sleeve. Then I dropped in some warmer green on the top of the leaf, being careful not to touch the upper leaf because it was still wet. Then I took some more of the warmer green and applied on the right bottom side of the sleeve, making small quick brush movement to create the texture on the side of the leaf. Now this part on the top of the leaf is dry, so I can paint the part that was touching the other leaf. Then I took some burnt umber in a heavy consistency and laid it around in some places on the leaf. When the shine on the paper was gone, I used the lifting technique to create the veins. I used a small amount of very dilute burnt sienna with the warm green to paint this branch. Thank you so much for watching till the end. Please share, like and subscribe if you haven't already. See you next week with a new tutorial. Bye for now.